Welcome to Vibe Talks.
Great to be here.
Why do we sometimes see, seemingly normal folks caught up in really bizarre situations or disturbing ones even?
Yeah, it's a fundamental question about human nature, isn't it?
And have you ever had that moment where you wonder, why didn't I help? You really probably should have, but didn't.
Oh, absolutely. That hesitation, it's more common than we think.
It's a real puzzle. So today on the deep dive, we're tackling some of these captivating riddles. We're looking at human behavior through 3 huge studies in social psychology.
Landmark studies, really. They tell us so much.
We'll explore how quickly people can fall into roles, sometimes scary roles, like in the Stanford prison experiment. Then there's that counterintuitive reason why we might freeze up in an emergency, the bystander effect.
Right, that one's fascinating.
And finally, the almost like magnetic pull of the group in Ash's conformity studies.
Yeah, the power of fitting in.
So get ready for a journey that's, well, both logical and frankly, pretty thrilling into the hidden forces shaping why we do what we do.
Exactly. And these experiments, looking back, they raise ethical questions. Definitely.
Oh, for sure. You couldn't do some of them today.
No way. But the insights, they give us these compelling, almost unsettling glimpses into our social instincts. They make you question how predictable we really are.
Okay, so let's dive in. First up, the Stanford prison experiment. Philip Zimbardo, 1972.
Right. Stanford University.
Okay, set the scene for us. What was the basic idea?
Well, they took 24 college students, screened them first, all mentally and physically healthy guys.
Okay.
And they randomly assigned them. Half became guards, half became prisoners.
Randomly. So it wasn't about personality type.
Nope, pure chance. And the prison, it was actually set up in the basement of the psychology department building at Stanford.
Wow. In the basement. Sounds almost like a stage set.
It kind of started that way, maybe, but reality got intense fast. What's really striking, and yeah, a bit chilling, is how the guards behaved.
They weren't given specific orders on how to be guards, were they?
No, that's the key. No specific instructions on tactics, just maintain order. But very quickly, they started acting quite abusively.
Abusively? Like what kind of things?
Things like stopping prisoners from eating, taking away their mattresses, making them do push-ups, sometimes with guards stepping on their backs, degrading chores, even forcing nudity. It escalated.
And this was just college kids playing roles.
Exactly. And the prisoners, even though they knew deep down it was an experiment, they started becoming really passive, submissive. Some seemed genuinely distressed, dehumanized.
There was that one incident, wasn't there? Really early on.
Yeah, that was shocking. Prisoner, #8612. After only 36 hours.
36 hours? That's barely a day and a half.
Right. He had a severe breakdown, deep depression, uncontrollable crying, fits of rage, just completely overwhelmed. They had to pull him out.
Wow. And he wasn't the only one, right?
No. Others started showing similar symptoms, signs of extreme anxiety and depression. It was clear this wasn't just, playing. The situation was having profound psychological effects.
So the whole thing was supposed to run for 2 weeks.
14 days, yeah. That was the plan.
But it didn't last nearly that long.
Not even close. They shut it down after only 6 days.
6 days? Why? What was the tipping point?
Things were spiraling. But it actually took someone from the outside looking in. Zimbardo's girlfriend at the time, Christina Maslach, who was also a psychologist.
She visited a prison.
She did. And she was horrified by what she saw. She basically confronted Zimbardo and said, "What you're doing to these boys is terrible."
So her perspective was crucial.
Absolutely. Zimbardo himself was acting as the prison superintendent, so he was kind of in the experiment too, maybe lost some objectivity. Her reaction really forced them to see how bad it had gotten.
It's incredible. Just 6 days to go from healthy students to that.
It underscores the sheer power of the situation, how quickly roles and contexts can shape, even override, individual personality.
So the big takeaway is, context is king. Situations can make ordinary people do extraordinary things, sometimes terrible things.
That's the main conclusion, yes. The power of the situation can be immense. It suggests that maybe the line between good and evil isn't as fixed inside us as we like to think. It can depend heavily on the circumstances.
Makes you think about real-world situations, right? Power dynamics in workplaces, military settings.
Exactly. Though it's important to add a little nuance.
Okay.
Some critics point to demand characteristics. The idea that the guards might have been acting in ways they thought Zimbardo wanted them to act, like they were fulfilling the expected role of a tough guard.
Ah, so maybe not purely spontaneous, but influenced by perceived expectations.
It's a possibility. It doesn't negate the power of the situation, but it adds another layer. And of course, the ethical issues mean we can't replicate it to test these nuances further.
Right, a truly unsettling but logically powerful insight into how roles can shape us. Okay, let's shift gears. The bystander effect. This one often starts with a really grim story, doesn't it?
It does. The murder of Kitty Genovese in New York City back in 1964.
The story initially reported was just horrific, right?
Yeah.
Dozens of witnesses who supposedly did nothing.
Yeah, the initial New York Times article claimed 38 witnesses saw or heard the attack over about half an hour and didn't call the police. Now, later investigations revised that number downwards. Significantly fewer people likely understood the full extent of what was happening.
Okay, so the initial story might have been exaggerated.
Somewhat, yeah. But the core event, a brutal public crime where intervention was delayed or absent, still became a catalyst. It sparked intense interest in this question. Why don't people help sometimes, especially when there are lots of witnesses?
It seems so backwards. More people, more potential helpers, you'd think.
That's the intuitive thought, but the research points the other way. The bystander effect describes this inverse relationship. The more people present during an emergency, the less likely any single person is to step forward and help.
Less likely. That's the logically baffling part. Why?
Well, two psychologists, John Darley and Bib Latani, designed some really clever experiments in the late 60s to figure that out.
Okay, what did they do? I remember reading about one with smoke.
That's one of them. They had participants fill out questionnaires in a room. Sometimes the participant was alone, sometimes with two other genuine participants, and sometimes with two Confederates actors pretending to be participants who were instructed to ignore anything unusual. Then, smoke started pouring into the room through a vent, clearly an ambiguous sign of potential danger, right?
Yeah, definitely. So what happened?
The results were striking. When participants were alone, 75% reported the smoke fairly quickly.
Okay, makes sense.
When they were in groups of 3 naive participants, that dropped to 38%.
Wow, almost halved.
But here's the kicker. When they were in the room with the 2 passive Confederates who ignored the smoke, only 10% reported it.
10%? That's chillingly low. Just because the other 2 people weren't reacting.
Precisely. It points to a couple of key psychological processes happening. One is pluralistic ignorance, or social proof. We look to others for cues on how to interpret a situation. If nobody else looks concerned, we might think, oh, maybe it's not serious, maybe it's steam, or I'm overreacting.
So we follow the crowds in action.
Right. The other major factor is diffusion of responsibility.
I think I know this one. Like, everyone assumes someone else will handle it.
Exactly that. If you're the only witness, the responsibility is 100% on you. Call 911, do something. But if there are 10 other people...
You figure someone else is probably already called.
Right.
Or someone else is more qualified to help.
Right. The sense of personal obligation gets diluted, spread thin across the group. There might also be a fear of embarrassment, looking foolish if you intervene, and it turns out not to be an emergency.
So, pluralistic ignorance, diffusion of responsibility, it all adds up to potential inaction. This has huge real-world implications.
Massive. For first aid, for reporting crimes, for any situation where someone needs help in public.
Is there anything we can do? How do we overcome this effect in ourselves?
The single most powerful thing, awareness. Just knowing that the bystander effect exists.
Really? Just knowing about it helps.
Studies suggest it does. When you're aware of these psychological tendencies, the diffusion of responsibility, the tendency to look to others, you can consciously counteract them. You can recognize the hesitation for what it is and make a deliberate choice to act.
So the takeaway is, be aware of the effect and consciously decide you will be the one to act, or at least assess the situation directly instead of assuming others have it covered.
That's the core message. Don't assume. Take responsibility.
Okay, powerful stuff. Now for our third experiment, Ash's conformity experiment. Let me ask you, honestly, do you think you could be convinced that, say, black is white if everyone around you insisted it was?
It seems impossible, right? Especially for something visually obvious. But Solomon Ash's work from 1951 suggests maybe we're more susceptible than we think.
Okay, tell us about this experiment. It sounds simple on the surface.
It was deceptively simple. He showed participants cards. One card had a single vertical line, the standard line. Another card had 3 vertical lines of different lengths, labeled A, B, and C.
Right.
The task was just to say which line, A, B, or C, was the same length as the standard line. And crucially, the correct answer was always really obvious.
So if you were doing it alone, you'd get it right pretty much every time.
Exactly. In control trials with no group pressure, people were accurate over 99% of the time. Error was almost non-existent.
Okay, so where does the conformity come in?
The setup. The real participant was put in a room with several other people, usually 6 to 8. But here's the twist. All those other people were Confederates, actors working with Ash.
Okay, I see where this is going.
On certain critical trials, Ash had instructed all the Confederates one by one to give the same incorrect answer before it was the real participant's turn to speak.
So imagine you're sitting there, you know line B is the right answer, but everyone before you confidently says line A.
Precisely. What do? Stick to your guns. Or go along with the group.
And the results were, well, revealing.
Extremely revealing,
Yeah.
and quite surprising at the time. Across the critical trials, participants conformed to the clearly wrong majority answer about 37% of the time.
Wow, over a third of the time, they gave an answer they likely knew was wrong.
Yes, and about 75% of participants conformed at least once during the experiment.
That's astounding.
Yeah.
Why? Did they actually start to believe the group's wrong answer?
That's the interesting part. When Ash interviewed them afterwards, most participants said they didn't really believe the group's answer was correct. They knew their own eyes weren't deceiving them.
So why conform?
Primarily, it was about avoiding discomfort. They didn't want to stand out, look foolish, or disrupt the group harmony. It was normative influence, the desire to fit in and be accepted, rather than informational influence, which would be genuinely believing the group is right.
The sheer pressure of not wanting to be the odd one out.
Yeah.
Even over something visually obvious.
It's a powerful force. It shows how much we value social cohesion, sometimes even over objective truth.
Have these findings held up over time? Is this still relevant?
Very much so. There was a big meta-analysis, a study of studies, by Bond and Smith in 1996. They looked at Ash-like experiments across many cultures and decades, and they found the conformity effect is robust, though the level of conformity can vary depending on cultural factors, group size, and so on. But the basic phenomenon holds true.
It's a fundamental aspect of group dynamics.
It seems to be. Although, interestingly, there was a clever adaptation of the study later that tried to remove the face-to-face pressure by having participants log answers privately, thinking they were seeing others' responses. In that setup, without the direct social presence, the conformity effect largely disappeared.
So that really highlights the social pressure aspect, the fear of immediate judgment.
Exactly. It adds a layer of complexity, showing it's not just about disagreeing, but about disagreeing publicly.
Okay, so we've explored 3 really foundational and honestly quite thrilling studies in their own way. Let's quickly recap the big ideas.
Sure. From the Stanford prison experiment, the key takeaway is the immense power of the situation and social roles, how context can dramatically shape behavior, pushing ordinary people towards unexpected, sometimes disturbing actions.
Right. Good or bad, the situation matters. Then, the bystander effect.
That teaches us the counterintuitive logic that more witnesses can actually decrease the chance of help due to things like diffusion of responsibility and looking to others for cues. Awareness is key to overcoming it.
And Ash's conformity work.
That demonstrates our surprising susceptibility to group pressure, how the desire to fit in can lead us to conform to opinions we know are wrong, especially in face-to-face situations.
So together, they paint this picture of us as deeply social creatures, profoundly influenced by our environment, the people around us, and the roles we inhabit. It's a logical framework, but the outcomes can be quite dramatic.
Absolutely. Understanding these forces doesn't mean we're just puppets, but it gives us critical insight into the often invisible currents that guide our actions and reactions. It allows for more self-awareness.
It really does. So, maybe a final thought for everyone listening. Considering these experiments, what kind of everyday situations do you think exert the strongest, maybe hidden influence on your behavior? And how can knowing about these studies help you be more mindful of those powerful social forces?
That's a great question to reflect on. These studies, they raise fundamental questions about ourselves and society. Knowing these tendencies exist, what responsibilities does that place on us?
Definitely food for thought. And if this deep dive into these classic psychology experiments has piqued your interest, believe me, there's so much more out there.
Oh, yeah. Split brain research, studies on motivation, memory. The field is vast and full of fascinating insights.
So we definitely encourage you to keep exploring if you found this logical and thrilling journey into the mind interesting. It's all part of understanding the complex, sometimes predictable, sometimes surprising ways we humans tick. Keep listening, keep thinking.